It begins with a parade, but not the kind of parade an empire throws. Not legions of people marching in, not trumpets blasting, or with rulers flexing their strength. Instead, Jesus enters Jerusalem riding a donkey, not on a war horse, surrounded by peasants and friends. And they wave branches and they cry out, Hosanna, which means save us. But they don't yet know what that salvation is going to cost, or even what kind of king that they're welcoming. Now, historians tell us that during Passover, there were 2 processions happening that day. On the west side of the city, Pilate was entering the gates with a show of force to remind all the Jews who were celebrating the Passover in that space the power over them. He entered from the west gate, and he had war horses and battle gear, and crowds were actually required to go to that gate to watch. And meanwhile, as that procession is happening, enters Jesus from the east gate with a borrowed colt and no gear. So 2 processions, 2 different identities of what a kingdom can look like. 2 kinds of power, 2 kingdoms in direct opposition of each other. One that's built on fear, and the other that's built on love. One that maintains its power through violence, and one that is carried forward through vulnerability. One that is deeply rooted in the domination of peoples, and the other that is rooted in mercy and kindness. Now, Jesus enters in on that procession, and the scripture tells us that then he goes to the temple, which was his custom. We heard about that a few weeks ago, that he came into the temple and he preached his first sermon. But this time, when Jesus comes into the temple, things have changed. And he doesn't stay quiet about it. Instead, he walks in to the heart of a place of prayer that has turned into religious power. And he starts flipping the tables. So if your identity of Jesus is this God, this person who's just lovey-dovey all the time, this might challenge your understanding of who Jesus is. And that's good, because we should challenge our understanding of who Jesus is. So he flips the tables because he knew at the core of his being that this is supposed to be a house of prayer, and instead it had become a marketplace, a place of transaction, of gatekeeping, a reflection of the wrong kingdom. Right? Imagine riding in on the colt, knowing this powerful force is on the other side, and then you enter into the house of God, and it has become the house of the empire. See, Jesus isn't angry at faith. He's angry that the faith had forgot justice, that the poor were having to pay large sums of money just to meet in the presence of God, and that if you didn't meet an exact requirement of what it meant to be clean, then it was no longer a house that you were welcome to. It was a place, and had become a place, where the poor were taxed in order to worship, where the unclean were excluded, and where holiness had become a product to buy and sell. And so he disrupts it. And then the scripture continues on that last line, and it says, and he went to the temple every day and taught. Then later that week, we know the story goes on, that Jesus gathers with his disciples in a borrowed room to celebrate this Passover, which was why everybody was in the city. A Passover meal which reminds people of God's liberation throughout human history, about how God had cared with them with this manna and mercy and fed his people through this exodus and brought new life and a new home to the people. But his friends didn't know that it was going to be their final meal together. And you can tell because they're arguing. And they're arguing about the stupidest of things. Who's going to be the greatest? Right? You ever had that dinner conversation? Which one of us is greatest? Who's going to sit at the right hand of Jesus when all this is done? And it's in the midst of that conversation that Jesus begins to unrobe himself and kneels in front of them and begins to wash their feet. And then he invites them to the table to remind them of God's manna and mercy and remind them of God's liberation. And he breaks bread and he pours out wine and he redefines power. The greatest among you must become the least. The leader must be a servant. This is a new table. It's the table of a new kind of kingdom. It's a table of manna and mercy. But there was a clash of two kingdoms. In Jerusalem, this contrast couldn't have been clearer on that last week of Jesus' life. There was one kingdom that said, power is domination. And Jesus says, power is service. The empire said, you need to secure your place at all costs. And Jesus said, you need to give your place away. The empire said, you got to win at all costs. And Jesus says, you got to love at all costs. See, the cross is not an accident this week. It is the empire's response to the threat of love. Jesus didn't die because he failed. He died because he succeeded in showing a better way, and the empire could not tolerate it. His way exposed their way. And they did what the empire does. They chose to silence him. But in doing so, the empire revealed its own emptiness. Because the cross wasn't the end, it was the unveiling of everything to come. See, the crowd, even Jesus' followers, wanted a king who would overthrow Rome. And Jesus refused to play their game. He said, you don't even know what you're asking for. He didn't outfight the empire, which is what they all wanted. He outloved it. He didn't come to seek to replace one set of rulers with another set of rulers. He came to dismantle the very idea that power could ever be built on exclusion. He came to offer a new kingdom where forgiveness is greater than vengeance, where humility is greater than status, and where sacrifice will always be greater than self-preservation. And this kingdom, it's not just coming. It is here. And it's breaking in through the people who follow Jesus. Not to a throne, but to a table. So what do we do with this? What do we do with a king who rides a donkey and flips tables and washes feet and breaks bread. First, we got to stop looking for a God in a throne room because he's not there. And we have to start looking around at our own tables. We have to stop waiting for a new empire to save us because the empire will never save us. We have to start participating in the kingdom that already is. Because here's the scandal. Jesus still rides into our cities. Jesus still flips our systems. And he still kneels with a towel. And he still sets the table with bread and wine. And that humble, ordinary table is, in fact, the revolution we're all looking for. This is how God undoes empire. Not by force, but by feeding. Not by control, but by communion. And not with legions of people, but with love. And so we who keep waving our palm branches and praying our hosannas have choices to make. Are we only going to follow Christ when he feels useful for us? Or even when he's dangerous? Will we sit at his table even if it means that we have to get up from our own thrones? See, the table is open. And the kingdom is here. And love is on the move. This week, I got to sit with 30 religious leaders from Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, you name it, they were there. And we were together for the sole purpose of working on our own souls. And you cannot imagine what happened over the table of breakfast and lunch and dinner. Because it's at the table where we are all transformed. This is the revolution. Please pray with me. God, as we come to your table, help us to release the empire that resides within us and to step into your kingdom where we are family, where we are one in your presence, where we are your children. And release ourselves to your grace and your manna and your mercy. Feed our weary souls. Mend our broken hearts.